Hi, everybody. I'm Zack Johnson. I'm the creative director of Asymmetric. We made a game 15 years ago that some of you might remember called Kingdom of Loathing. It was a browser-based multiplayer role-playing game, stick figure art, a lot of goofy jokes. And a few months ago, I forgot how long it's been. A couple of years ago, we started working on the follow-up game, West of Loathing. A few months ago, we released it. It's a lot of the same team in common, a few new people brought on to make this. But yeah, that's who I am and what we're doing. Because talking about comedy is one of the least funny things I can imagine doing. When they asked me to do this talk, I kind of didn't want to, and then the more I thought about it, the more I didn't want to. And then in February, I got lucky because Tim Schafer accidentally wrote my entire talk for me in this tweet. And that's pretty much the secret. Like, we decided when we started making this thing that it was going to be a comedy game. It wasn't going to be an adventure game or an RPG with comedy elements, but it was going to straight up be a comedy game. Instead of a game with jokes in it, which happens all the time, this was sort of a game made out of jokes. And so we didn't consciously arrive at a bunch of bullet point lists of how we were doing this, right? When it came time to write this talk, we were sort of like, wait, how did we do, what was our approach to this? And we kind of started with the fundamental basis of all of the writing that happens in the game is this relationship between the narrator and the player. Because it's a Western RPG, in both senses, the character, we wanted as much as possible for the character to just be a kind of a cipher, an avatar of the player. We didn't want to they didn't have a real strong character, they didn't have strong opinions about things. We wanted to write them as the way that you want to write, or the way that we wanted to write it, which was just sort of neutral and friendly, and you can make some assumptions about them, they want to be here, they like their parents, they don't like being annoyed or beaten up or whatever. But for the most part, just let the player kind of inhabit that character. But the narrator, and so this is nothing super novel. I think if you looked up narrator in the dictionary, it would probably just say this, but the narrator is me and Riff, the other writer, sort of talking to the player. But what's cool about that is that it allows us to just kind of treat the narrator as a character. And because we've been doing this for so long, it's a character that we've been developing for 15 years. Having the entirety of the sort of non-spoken text in the game be a dialogue between us and the player in the form of the player character has a lot of advantages in terms of being able to just cram jokes into literally everywhere. Every piece of text you see in the game, whether it's in the options menu, item description, exposition about what happens when you open a door or whatever, it's all this character that you get used to. And so literally every piece of text becomes the opportunity for us to at least try to be funny. It's a real quantity over quality kind of approach, but it works because if you have a game with 4 jokes in it and one of them is bad, your game is only 75% funny. But if you have a game with 1,000 jokes in it and 250 of them are bad, then your game is 75% funny. The narrator as a sort of honest character, an honest reflection of who we are as writers, also lets us be a little self-deprecating about stuff, which is a fantastic way to cover up fundamental flaws with your game, act like they're on purpose and like they were, we meant to do that because isn't that funny? You don't want to overdo it, but honestly, because of the way the game looks, people come in with a set of expectations that is not, this is going to be this amazing, sweeping, epic thing, right? And so it's okay to be a little goofy about it because it is a little goofy. It's not about being the biggest video game that it can be. It's about sitting around with us having a fun conversation. Having the narrator talk to the character as its own character lets you also, you don't want to tell the player character how they feel, right? But what you can do is say, wow, that was pretty scary, huh? thus saying, well, if that had happened to me, I would be pretty angry right now. How do you feel about that? And it lets you convey emotion and opinions about stuff without undermining the player's ability to inhabit the player character. And the nice thing about that is when it's so silly, it also doesn't have to be consistent. Like if the narrator likes ketchup, when it's funny for the narrator to like ketchup, they can not like ketchup later if it's funnier for them to not like ketchup, depending on what you're trying to do with ketchup. Typically, in interactions between the player and the narrator, we have the player as kind of the straight man, and the narrator just sort of messes with you, and you push back against it, and that's where a lot of the humor of that interaction comes from. Every once in a while, and I think I do this a little bit more than Riff does, I like to give the player the opportunity to be the sort of annoying kid brother that just kind of repeats everything that the narrator says until the narrator gets really aggravated, and you move on from there. But for the most part, when the entire game takes place in this kind of jokey buddy cop sort of conversation between the narrator and the character, just the default means of exposition for what's happening in the game becomes an opportunity for comedy. And also sometimes, so there's a moment in the prologue of the game where we introduce the sort of minor equivalent of a morality system we have, where there's this guy sleeping outside of a cave that you're supposed to arrest some dudes in, and you can decide whether you want to just kill him while he's sleeping. And the narrator kind of pushes back against that because we don't want it to be easy for the player to get into this sort of like, well, I'm a cold-blooded killer, because we didn't really want to write a lot of stuff to support the player as a cold-blooded killer, because that's less funny. So you get a lot of opportunities to be talked out of murdering this kid. And the thing that I noticed, which was weird, is that when we were demoing this at PAX and stuff, every time somebody went through that, they did it with this huge grin on their face the entire time. And I'm just sitting there at first thinking, no, I thought we were going to remove this from the game because this is not funny. Like, this is like trying to warn you that the stuff that you are doing is not on tone with what we want you to do. But people just loved it. And so I think as a result of that, we ended up doing a lot more kind of stuff where the narrator argues with the player and just sort of tries to get in the way of stuff. It's hard to tell when to stop doing that because it's gotten annoying, but we're usually not there when people are playing, so we don't really care. It also allows you to break the fourth wall without it being super obnoxious. Like, we try to do it sparingly because it's, you just don't want to get too, we don't want the player to constantly be acknowledging that they're in a video game. We don't really want the narrator to constantly be acknowledging that it's a video game, but sometimes it helps. There's the kind of in-fiction way where, so there's a series of spittoons in the game that are really gross to get into, and I remember I set up the first one in there, and I told Riff, okay, write this. There's going to be 6 or 7 of these, and they should get grosser and grosser as the game goes on. And he wrote the first one so gross that I had no idea how he was going to move on from there. But what he did was a thing that turned out to be one of the things that people liked the most about this, which was that it turns into this weird series of kind of arguments between the player and the narrator, where the narrator gradually just starts acknowledging, like, look, I don't want to say this stuff. Like, I don't want you to do this. I don't want to have to describe this stuff to you. And it's cool just because by the time you get there, you've gotten used to the voice of the narrator, and so the fourth wall breaking becomes, just like a little bit of a surprise. The thing that I like about it, and this is not funny at all, but it also lets you do things like, there's a hat that you can find that's kind of hidden in the prologue that unlocks a really hard combat mode, and you can't get away from it, and the narrator can just tell you that. And the thing that I sort of feel like was the best use of this was at the end, once you've finished the main storyline of the game and you can click the thing to like get the ending cutscene, it just tells you this is not going to change anything about your character or the state of the world. You can just watch this cutscene and then you can leave and do something else and you can come back and do it again. Like, you don't need to save. You can't save. But I wish games sort of had the confidence to let you know stuff like that, because there's nothing more annoying to me than getting 40 hours into some RPG and then not knowing that I'm about to do something that means I should have saved or I have to revert to an hour ago. Biggest advantage is that when everything that we write in the game has this voice that is trying to be funny, writing it is not a chore, because it's great. Like, we just get to write jokes all day, and what could be better than that? Obviously, it's work. I mean, you make games, you know that even the fun parts of it are work. But it is nice that essentially everything that we do becomes, at worst, a puzzle that we have to solve to figure out a way to make some boring thing funny. How do we make the graphics quality options funny. And then that was another thing that was like a few minutes of work and then people loved it. It also, the fact that we had to do it this way sort of talked us out of the idea of having some kind of codex that you would unlock encyclopedia entries about stuff. 'Cause we were sort of worried moving from Kingdom of Loathing to West of Loathing. Well, this game has animation and the combat is like stuff's moving around. We're not gonna have enough opportunities to write stuff. We should add some structures that let us just put a bunch of text in front of people. And I'm really glad that we didn't do that. Instead, we found other little cracks to put it in. And I don't think anybody's gonna criticize West of Loathing for not having enough writing in it. So that's good. So this is going to be longer because there's a lot of stuff we don't do. Because the game is made out of comedy, the reward for the player for doing everything is more or less just going to be more jokes. Like you walk into a room, you see that it has 5 objects in it, you know that you can probably click them to at least get an attempt at something funny. Maybe just a pun, whatever. We don't want the systems of the game to get in the way of that. We don't want to make you feel bad by blocking you from finding this stuff. So I mean, we did stuff like putting really good gear in all the spittoons, which are not hard to find and they're not hard to get through, right? We just kind of wanted the game to not be particularly challenging. We added an optional hard mode just in case, but we needed to stick to the core. This game is made of jokes, and so we didn't want to do adventure game kind of puzzles where we essentially decided, well, we didn't start out making an adventure game actually because none of us really like adventure games that much because of this kind of stuff, but it gradually dawned on us that we were accidentally making an adventure game, so then we were kind of stuck in it. And so we decided, all right, if there's a puzzle that requires a needle as its solution, we don't want the player to live in a world where there is only one needle, and if you didn't find it, you can't get past the puzzle. So we just decided to put a needle in every haystack. There are occasional hard puzzles, right? There are some math puzzles. There are some weird Morse code and Braille stuff hidden in some of the stuff that Kevin put in. But they're either so out of the way that people aren't going to feel bad about missing them, or we put in some kind of just brute force. Like you can eventually get a stat high enough to just skip this, and it's fine. I had a brief aside that I'm gonna skip. Combat. The system, this is definitely the weakest part of the game, and we all know this, right? And if we didn't know it, a bunch of reviews told us. The system is great and flexible, and it's capable of doing a lot of cool stuff, but we kind of just didn't. We ran out of time, and we ran out of money, and so we ended up with combat not in fantastic shape. And we decided, well, given that there's not really any way to make this super funny just on its own, and we don't have time to make it super satisfying, let's just make it really easy. People will like that. I thought that would be a happy face at the end there, but it was a sad face. And it's important when you find something that contradicts everybody and makes you feel better about yourself that you put it in a bigger font. I think that making the combat easy and just getting it out of the way really served our goal of making the game be a game that is about jokes. Let's see. In a video game like this, there's gonna be a bunch of stuff that you have to do over and over and over again, and moving between areas on the map in this game is a thing that happens all the time. And so one of the things that we had to do was write a tremendous number of random encounters so that stuff didn't get repetitive. And pretty early on, we realized that the scope of what was gonna happen in random encounters had to go way down so that it was essentially just writing. We had thought that maybe random encounters would be like a room that you went into with some stuff that you could interact with, but that would have taken way too long. So we ended up able to cram 200 of them in there because a lot of them were somewhat formulaic, but 3 different crates that you open with 3 different jokes, that's 3 different jokes. It's a game about jokes, so that counts as 3 encounters. Segue, it's important if you don't have a segue to just say segue, so you know there's supposed to be one there. And I'm doing another talk about our tool chain and the design postmortem for West of Loathing tomorrow in the main conference, so I'll get way more into this there. But the tools that we built on the back end and the engine that was built on the front end were really optimized to just let us cram as much stuff in there as quickly as we could. And that was very important to avoiding repetition, to being able to get all those random encounters in there, to being able to just maximalize the text so that there were just as many jokes as possible, so that one of them was funny, then we win. Colorblind mode is a joke that a bunch of reviews picked up on, a bunch of people just thought was funny. And what was cool about that is that the amount of work that it took to add that option to the game was literally typing this into a text bucket that we had, and it added the option. And every system in the back end of the development tools for this stuff was like that. Everything just made it as easy as possible for us to do stuff before we talked ourselves out of it. Another important axiom, and what I mean to say here is that because the game is about jokes, often a joke is better than a good thing that's harder to make than a joke. We had two sort of big towns in the game, and I wanted there to be gambling mini games in both of them, and I didn't really have a good idea for either of them. And so, like the poker game in the opening town's saloon, like I agonized over it, and I put it off, and I put it off, and I put it off, and then I did all this work making this system that it's not bad exactly, but it's just not good. It was a bunch of work. I probably could have just omitted that room from the saloon, and nobody but me would have known that there was ever supposed to be anything there, and I didn't even know what was supposed to be there, so it would have been fine to just omit it, but it was a bunch of work, and it resulted in this thing that was not particularly interesting to anybody. Nobody talks about it. I knew from the exhaustive research that I did watching HBO's Deadwood several years ago, that in Deadwood, Faro was a card game that was more popular than poker. So we decided in the Breadwood camp that we would have a version of Faro. I especially didn't have an idea for that. So what I ended up doing was like, what if this is just a game where you name as many pharaohs as you can, and how you do is determined by how well you can lie to the other people that are playing. And that works, right? That is actually kind of funny. And the poker game was like 268 lines of script, not funny at all. The Pharaoh game was 89 lines of script. And we also ended up with this random Pharaoh name generator that I'm hoping to license to Campo Santo for In the Valley of Gods. They haven't gotten back to me yet. So Riff, the other writer, he's the one who does all of the, almost all of the NPC dialogue. Because when I write an NPC, it's usually me with some sort of weird vocal tick and an errand they're not willing to run. So I asked him, hey, pretend you have a list of things that you do when you're writing an NPC and tell me what those things are so that I can put them in this talk. So first thing he talked about was the voice of the NPC and what they would sound like if they were talking. Like, do they have an accent? Do they drop H's? Do they clip G's at the end of words? Do they say or Going on further from that, how much of that can we put in before it becomes too annoying to read? Does it even work in text? Because one thing we absolutely were never going to do was VO, so we needed to make sure it wasn't annoying to actually be able to imagine what the character sounded like. For major characters, we had these really short, and it's important in presentations to have a lot of text on a slide. That's one thing I've read. We wrote these sort of short Bibles about what kind of, what's this character like? What do they sound like? And doing those early, because these were like the partners that you can take with you. So there were going to be hundreds of conversations with these guys. Another thing to determine about them is generally just a mood, which determines all right, what's the sort of overall flavor of the jokes that you're going to get from these guys? An important thing about them that I would never have thought about, actually, until Riff pointed this out, was essentially how much of the player's BS is this character willing to put up with? Because that kind of determines whether the humor of the interaction comes from something that's funny about the NPC or the sort of resistance of the NPC to what the player is trying to bring to the table. A few other random things imagine what they look like, and then it's easier to imagine them saying stuff. For us, that's easy because it's just it's very abstract, right? They look like stick figures, and so in our imagination, they can look like whatever they want. What do they want? Maybe it's something stupid. That would be funny. Maybe it's something weird, and then you can ask them why they want that weird thing, and then maybe there's a funny reason for it. Why don't they already have it? Maybe they're afraid of something that's not scary. Maybe they're too drunk or too lazy to go get it themselves. That lets the player make fun of the person a little bit. What are they doing when you find them? Especially for random encounters, this is where just a lot of the stuff that I remember most as funny moments in the games is these things that I would encounter when I was playtesting that Riff had written and I had never seen before. And so it was cool to just find these weird characters in different parts of the world doing weird stuff. How do they feel about you interrupting them? Another source of either them being annoyed with you, or them being annoyed with you is funnier than them being grateful to you, so we probably erred on the side of that a little bit. If you have just a one-off interaction with somebody that doesn't need to have any mechanical effect or anything, you can often just do a real easy thing, like maybe it's funny because they can't hear you and you keep having to repeat yourself, or maybe they have a weird accent or aren't from around here and so you have a hard time understanding them, or maybe there's some outrageous thing about the environment or some outrageous thing about them, a sort of Saturday Night Live character, and you can lean into that for the duration of a short conversation. Or maybe they're really bad at their job and they don't understand that they're bad at their job, and that's funny, like Monty Python is funny. Doing this makes it kind of hard to hang anything important on the character, but it's pretty easy. And if you're just trying to make a lot of them, then it's a nice way to make a kind of a fun interlude. In writing jokes on the internet for 15 years, we've had a lot of chances to look at stuff we wrote a year ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago and see how they hold up and see how we feel about them. And so we've kind of learned, and there are a lot of examples of all of these things that I'm about to say that we don't do in Kingdom of Loathing. Don't at me. We try to avoid topical stuff. Like, this happened while we were making the game, and it's funny and everybody likes it, but it would be nonsense if the game, which came out in August, had a thing that was about this and required you to understand this, right? You never know which things are gonna last. And it's like some joke equivalent to this from 10 years ago, maybe we'll put in a thing about it, and if you get it, you get it. But we try in general with references to not make it such that it would just be nonsense if you don't get the reference. It's okay if it's a little weird, but it shouldn't just be like, hey, look, this is just, remember this thing? Just using somebody else's joke verbatim, this was funny once. And now it's just nothing makes me groan more than just encountering this. Yes, okay, all right, yes, that was funny when they did it however many years ago. Something that we, as we got older, gradually got more and more, felt more and more strongly about is that you just shouldn't be mean, right? There's no reason to. The tone that we established with Kingdom of Loathing was basically we didn't ever want to make fun of anything that somebody didn't choose. We can make a joke about, he's a hippie, he smells bad or whatever, but we kept religion out of it, but we obviously, it's pretty easy to not make jokes about race when everything is a stick figure. But that said, it's like, well, we're making a Western, there are some problems with this genre that we don't really have anything important to say about, right? And so we were a little worried that by just completely omitting the genocide of Native Americans from our game, that we would catch some heat for maybe whitewashing it. But then it turns out when you make a dumb comedy game, nobody seems to care about that. So I guess we dodged a bullet by thinking about that more than anybody else ever did. And this is just a little rougher in general, and I couldn't quite figure out what I was going to say while this slide was up, and I still don't know, so I'm eager to find out. We kind of determined in Kingdom of Loathing that we're not making fun of things that people didn't choose, and people don't necessarily choose their religion, and people don't necessarily choose their politics. And so what I like to think of is, say, a 17-year-old kid raised in a conservative household playing a game that's warm and funny and comes from a place where, we all think of ourselves as right-thinking progressives, but so does this kid. This kid doesn't know, And then suddenly he gets to some specific political thing where we say, hey, kid, turns out you're an asshole, and he had no idea. And now the entire message is just kind of wasted on him, as opposed to just being ambiently the right stuff as opposed to actively sort of aggressively aligned against the wrong stuff. That said, this is a very cowardly approach to politics, and I kind of just have to own that. And that also was a very bad choice for where to end the talk. So you might have questions like about the cake, for instance, and whether it's true or not. There's mics there.
Hi, I just want to say as a comedy writer, I'm really excited to talk to you because just a year ago, my comedy partner accused me of stealing the name of my killer guitar from his stab bat from Kingdom of Loathing. But I was wondering about, I write games that are not funny, but I put funny in them. What kind of feedback do you look for? Do you even look for when you're playtesting? How funny is it? Is it, does anybody say that's not funny and you take it out?
The question is how we deal with and how we look for feedback about the actual comedy aspects of it. And we kind of don't. Like we've been doing it the same way for so long that like our voice is what it is, and the players are kind of either here for it or they're not, and it's like if somebody comes up and criticizes the graphics, like I don't know what to tell you, buddy. Like you can either put up with this and see it for what it is, or you can't. Every once in a while there will be some internal argument about whether it's usually me. I will put in a joke that says that's something that doesn't make any sense, and so many people will report it like thinking it's a typo or a bug that Kevin will just constantly exhort me to change it. When you drink a cup of coffee in this game, it says, like let's say your character's name is Susan, it says, you drink the cup of Joe, and your reply is, my name's Susan, which I think that's funny because the insinuation is that you've misunderstood what the narrator is saying and think that the narrator thinks that your name is Joe, but then if that's the case, then why did they put it in this weird sentence and it got reported as a bug a bunch of times, but I just sort of insisted.
Yeah.
Right, because it just looks like a typo, right? If you don't, and it's not like a totally reasonable joke to get, right? Like what you're getting about this is that it's just sort of a weird thing that doesn't make a ton of sense, but I always ended up sticking to my guns on those things. I don't think we changed a single joke as a result of feedback in all of this. So.
So I noticed in the podcast, whenever some player asks you guys to make a joke like a clothing pun, you guys iterate and try again to find the right one. So how do you guys know when you find the right funny?
Either you get tired of looking or you find one that we just all sort of agree, like, okay, that's it, we're done. Like, it's usually pretty clear if you found a really good one, and it also becomes clear if you're not going to find a good one, so you just kind of basically stop wherever you were when you realize that. Might have been better to back up a couple to a slightly funnier one, but who has the time?
So you mentioned in the talk that you shouldn't let gameplay get in the way of humor if you're trying to make just a straight up comedy game, and also that you sort of made the combat easier to not make it get in the way of the comedy. Do you think there are any notable experiences in your time developing games where the gameplay or the mechanic worked extremely well in service of the humor?
That's hard to say, actually. Seems like the kind of thing I should have an answer for, but I think I don't. We just try to make that the default mode, but it doesn't ever. I don't think there's any moments where the game becomes really transcendently a comedy game. Like something like Jazz Punk is another game that I would say is just definitely a comedy game, and given that they are a first-person shooter, I think it is easier to turn tropes upside down than than our thing where it's just like, it's always going to be you're walking around in a room having conversations about stuff. So it's really more just here's a bunch of standard delivery for jokes than it is like we did something weird and expensive on the technical side that, I mean, I guess like the Norton, when he throws the anti-virus into your eyes and it messes up the screen, like that's a thing, right? That's like, oh, now everything looks really annoying until I figure out how to solve this quest. But I'm reluctant to draw attention to that because while I think it's funny, that's kind of a joke on the player rather than a joke at the player. So yeah, I don't know. 30 minutes. Thanks, everyone.